The 10-year-old boy looked at the stranded Hell's Angel and saw a machine that needed fixing. He kneeled, small hands working fast, and when the engine roared, he refused the money. "You looked like you needed help." The biker noticed the taped shoes and the eviction notice. That night, calls went out. At dawn, 300 motorcycles shook the crumbling Memphis streets. The boy who fixed a stranger's bike for nothing was about to be given everything. David is 10. Memphis. Eviction notice in his backpack, shoes mended with duct tape. He spends his days fixing abandoned engines because broken things make sense to him. When a Hell's Angel's bike dies on his street, David fixes it for free. The biker gives him nothing. Instead, he takes something, a look inside that backpack. That night, 300 Harleys roar into town. This is what happens when kindness gets noticed. David had stopped crying about the eviction 2 days ago. Now he just carried the pink slip folded small in the front pocket of his jeans, the way you carry something you hope disappears when you stop looking at it. He was 10. He didn't know the full math, but he knew his mother's paycheck ran out before the month did, and the yellow notice on the front door meant they had 3 weeks left in the house on Keating Street. His shoes were duct taped across the soles because the thrift store had run out of boys' size 4s, and the ground in late July was hot enough to melt glue. He didn't complain. He had a skateboard with one loose truck and a brain that lit up around broken machines, the way other kids lit up around video games. On the other side of Memphis, a man named Marcus Calloway, street name Sledge, was 300 miles from his chapter in Missouri, riding a blacked-out Harley Softail through neighborhoods the GPS never highlighted. He was 46, a master welder, a combat veteran, and a 20-year patch holder in the Hells Angels. The bike had been custom-built in his own garage over 18 months, every bolt torqued by his own hand. But engines don't care about loyalty. A failing spark plug socket had been slowly backing out for weeks, and by the time the cylinder flooded and died on a dead-end street near the old rail yard, Sledge was stranded in a part of town that didn't welcome strangers, let alone men who looked like him. He tried to reach the plug himself, but his hands were too big, his patience too thin. He cursed loud enough to echo off the boarded windows. Sweat poured down his full-sleeve tattoos. He pulled out his phone. No service. He pulled off his helmet and slammed it on the seat. That's when he noticed the boy on the skateboard, standing 30 feet away, watching him with the calm, patient stare of someone who had nothing to lose and nothing to prove. David had been on his way back from the junkyard on Chelsea Avenue, where a man named Gus let him pull parts from dead cars as long as he swept the bay floor. He'd spent the afternoon taking apart a rusted Chevy alternator, just to see if he could put it back together. He always could. He carried a small crescent wrench in his back pocket and a strip of sandpaper wrapped around his skateboard truck. He saw the Harley first, then the man. He didn't flinch at the patches or the ink or the sheer size of him because machines didn't care who owned them, and neither did David. He rolled closer, 1 foot pushing slow. "That's a bad plug," he said, voice even. "You got a socket wrench." Sledge stared at him for 3 full seconds. A child. A scrawny kid with taped shoes talking to him like a shade tree mechanic. "Boy, go home." David didn't move. "The plug's under the tank. You need a 3/8 swivel joint. You got one?" Sledge didn't have one. David produced it from his pocket like a magic trick. What happened next took 7 minutes. David knelt on the hot asphalt, small hands navigating the tight space between the tank and the head bolt, his wrist twisting in ways a grown man's couldn't. Sledge watched in silence. The boy worked without hesitation, without asking questions, his fingers feeling for threads the way his grandfather had taught him on a John Deere back in Mississippi before the family moved north. He reseated the plug, tightened the boot, stood up, wiped his greasy hands on his shorts. "Try it now." The engine turned over on the first crank, a deep, healthy rumble that filled the dead-end street like a heartbeat. Sledge let the bike idle, reached into his cut and pulled out a 20. He pushed it toward the boy. "You earned it, kid." David looked at the bill. He looked at the man, his mother's voice in his head. "We don't take charity, baby. We give help, we don't sell it." He shook his head. "You looked like you needed help." Sledge's hand stayed extended for a moment too long. He saw it then. The duct tape peeling at the toe. The outline of folded paper in the boy's front pocket, pink edge just visible, the word final printed in bureaucratic block letters. He'd seen eviction notices before. He'd handed cash to brothers facing the same thing. But this wasn't a brother. This was a child who had just done a stranger a kindness with no expectation, no fear, no transaction. Sledge tucked the 20 back into his vest. He didn't argue. He just nodded once like a man filing away a debt he intended to repay. That night, from a motel room off the interstate, Sledge made 3 calls. The first was to his chapter president in St. Louis. The second was to a contractor he knew in Nashville who owed him a favor. The third was to a man named Rooster, who ran the Angels regional charity rides and had a Rolodex of every tradesman within 500 miles who could swing a hammer on short notice. The conversations were short, the language coded in the way of men who ran businesses and built houses and rewired electrical panels during the week and wore a death's head on the weekend. "Found a kid in Memphis," Sledge said. "Smartest hands I've seen. His family's about to be on the street. I want a crew down here tomorrow dawn, whatever you can spare." Rooster didn't ask why. He just said, "How many?" Sledge looked at the ceiling. "As many as it takes." At 4:30 the next morning, before the sun had touched the top of the Hernando de Soto Bridge, the first low rumble began. It was faint at first, like distant thunder over the Mississippi. Then it grew. The windows on Keating Street started to vibrate, a slow, building tremble that made picture frames click against the walls. David woke up on the floor where he slept on a stack of blankets because his mattress had been sold 2 months ago to cover the water bill. He stood, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain. The street was dark, but coming around the bend, headlights cutting the mist, were motorcycles. Not 5, not 10. Rows of them, 2 by 2, a column of chrome and leather stretching back farther than he could see. 300 engines, throttled low, rolling through a forgotten neighborhood like a promise about to be kept. They didn't honk. They didn't rev. They rolled into that crumbling street in the gray pre-dawn with the discipline of a funeral procession. 300 engines so quiet you could hear the kickstands drop one by one. David's mother, Angela, was already on the porch, a bathrobe pulled tight, her eyes still swollen from the tears she'd cried the night before when she'd counted the money on the kitchen table and come up $200 short for the rent she couldn't pay. She saw the leather vests, the tattoos crawling up every neck, the winged skulls on every chest, and she did what any mother in a neighborhood like this would do. She grabbed her son by the shirt and pushed him behind her. Her voice didn't shake. "You got the wrong house. We don't have anything worth taking." Sledge killed his engine, swung off the bike, and walked toward the sagging porch steps with his hands visible, helmet under his arm, his face stripped of the anger she expected. "Ma'am, my name is Marcus. I met your son yesterday. He fixed my bike. He wouldn't let me pay him." He glanced at the eviction notice still taped to the front door, the pink paper curled from the humidity. "But I saw that, and I made some calls." Behind him, 300 men, welders and roofers and electricians and plumbers and contractors who'd driven through the night from Missouri and Arkansas and Tennessee, stood at attention in a neighborhood the city had long since stopped sending trucks to. They carried lumber, drywall, tool chests, bags of concrete, a grocery store's worth of food, a laptop still in the box, and a single saxophone case that belonged to a man named T-Bone who taught himself to play in a foster home at David's age and had never forgotten the music teacher who'd bought him his first instrument. He'd read the group chat at 3 a.m., pulled his savings, and driven from Little Rock. Angela's hand stayed on David's shoulder. She didn't know what to do with kindness that came with no strings. In her world, gifts came with hidden invoices, and men who looked like this came with danger. But Sledge just stood there waiting while the sun started to bleed orange over the rooftops. "Ma'am," he said, quieter now, "that boy of yours looked at a stranger and saw a person. That's rare. We'd like to make sure the world doesn't beat that out of him. If you'll let us." Angela looked down at David, who was still in his pajama shorts, barefoot, holding a crescent wrench he'd grabbed from the table without thinking. The boy nodded once, small. Angela stepped aside. What happened next was not a renovation. It was a resurrection. The Keating Street house, a 2-bedroom bungalow built in 1942, had been dying in slow motion for a decade. The roof sagged in the middle like a swayback horse. The front steps had crumbled so badly that the mail carrier stopped walking up them. The wiring was aluminum, the plumbing was rust, the foundation had cracked in 3 places, and the back bedroom where David slept on a pile of blankets smelled of mold, so thick it coated the back of your throat. Angela worked double shifts at a nursing home kitchen and still couldn't afford to fix a broken window. The eviction notice was just the final act in a long, slow collapse that had started long before the landlord sent the paperwork. But these men didn't see a lost cause. They saw a day's work. Rooster, the regional charity ride coordinator and a general contractor for 22 years, walked the property at 6:02 in the morning with a legal pad, sketching lines and load-bearing walls like a field surgeon triaging a patient. "We're gonna need scaffolding on the east side. Anderson, your crew takes the roof. Brooks, you're on the foundation piers. Anybody who's not a licensed electrician, keep your hands out of the panel. I'm not filling out paperwork for a fried brother." The men laughed and moved. By 6:30, the air was filled with the sound of pry bars and nail guns, the screech of rotten wood coming up, the heavy thud of fresh lumber hitting the ground. Neighbors stood on their porches in bathrobes, coffee cups forgotten, watching an army of outlaw bikers strip that housed down to its bones with more precision than any city work crew had ever brought to that zip code. David didn't leave the yard. He shadowed the men like a ghost apprentice, watching a welder patch the iron gate, watching an electrician run new Romex through the attic, watching a plumber sweat copper pipe with a torch so steady his hand might have been carved from stone. Nobody shooed him away. Nobody told him to go play. A man named Crank, who ran a custom fabrication shop in Nashville, handed David a pair of safety glasses and a dead blow hammer and said, "You want to learn something, little man? Hold this. Watch my hands." David held it. David watched. By noon, he was helping measure and mark stud lumber with a carpenter's pencil, his handwriting on the 2x4s neater than half the men's. Sledge stood in the shade of the old oak tree in the side yard, arms crossed, watching the boy move through the chaos like he'd been born on a job site. "That kid's got the mind," Rooster said, stepping up beside him. "I saw him do a spark plug swap yesterday. 10 years old, didn't hesitate." Rooster pulled a rag from his back pocket, wiped his neck. "What's the play after the house, Sledge? We fix a roof, they're still broke in 6 months." Sledge didn't answer right away. He'd been thinking the same thing. What they didn't know yet, what David and Angela couldn't have imagined, was that the men had been discussing a longer play since the group chat exploded the night before. Not just a roof, not just a pantry full of groceries, a trust, a workshop, a future. A man named Doc, who wasn't a real doctor but had done 2 tours as a medic and handled the charity fund for the St. Louis chapter, had already opened a high-yield college savings account on his phone at 5 a.m. and seeded it with $5,000 of his own money. The group chat had lit up with pledges. $50 here, $100 there. A contractor who owned a lumber yard in Cape Girardeau offered materials at cost. A man named Preacher, who'd spent his youth in a group home and had no children of his own, wired $2,000 with a single message: "Buy the boy a real toolbox." But the real shift, the thing that would make this story travel far beyond a single Memphis block, came at 3 in the afternoon. David's school had a summer program for gifted students, a robotics lab run by a retired engineer named Mr. Patterson, who'd been trying to get funding for a competitive team for 2 years. The program had been canceled that very morning due to budget cuts. Angela had been hiding the letter in her purse, too exhausted to tell her son that the one place he felt seen was gone. One of the bikers, a lanky man named Wires who wrote code for a defense contractor in St. Louis, overheard Angela mention it to a neighbor. He walked over, crouched down to David's level, and asked him what he wanted to build. David, for the first time all day, looked shy. "I want to build a drone that can deliver medicine for old people who can't leave their house." Wires stared at him for a long moment. Then he stood up, pulled out his phone, and walked to the backyard. By evening, he'd raised $18,000 in donations from his LinkedIn network alone, including a message from the CEO of a drone manufacturing company who'd seen the post and offered to donate a starter kit and a mentor. The sun was starting its slow descent over the Mississippi when the last of the framing was done. The roof was watertight. The new windows were in. The foundation had been stabilized, the moldy drywall hauled away, the cracked concrete porch replaced with a smooth, clean slab. Angela stood in the middle of what used to be her living room, a room she'd been terrified of losing, and she couldn't find the water stain on the ceiling because it wasn't there anymore. She put a hand over her mouth and just breathed. David walked in, covered in sawdust, holding the crescent wrench he'd carried all day. Sledge followed him, took a knee, and looked the boy in the eye. "You fixed my bike yesterday. You didn't ask for a thing. That tells me who you are." He pulled a folded document from inside his cut. It was the deed to the house, paid in full through a lien buyout that Doc had orchestrated with a title company that morning. "This is yours now. No more rent, no more eviction threats, and that's not all." He pointed to the detached garage in the back, which had been transformed in 12 hours into a miniature workshop with a workbench, a pegboard of tools, and a brand new tool chest with David's name engraved on a brass plate. "That's your lab. Build your drone, build your engine, build whatever's in your head. We'll be watching, we'll be helping. You understand?" David looked at the deed. He looked at the workshop. He looked at his mother, who was crying silently, and at the 300 men who had stopped their work and gathered in the yard, waiting. He didn't say thank you. He didn't cry. He just nodded, the same way he'd nodded before fixing that spark plug, and walked toward the garage, his bare feet still dusty, his heart so full it might have cracked open. And Sledge knew in that moment that this was just the beginning of something much larger than one house or one boy. The ripples were already moving. By morning, the story would hit the local news. By the end of the week, the nation would be watching. And the real challenges, the doubters, the bureaucrats, the people who didn't believe a child like David deserved this kind of miracle, were already sharpening their knives. Behind the scenes, a call was being made to the city permitting office by someone who didn't appreciate 300 Hells Angels building without city approval. The fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. The call came at 7:02 the next morning. A woman named Patricia Delaney, Senior Code Enforcement Officer for the Memphis Department of Planning and Development, had been forwarded a cell phone video by an anonymous teepster. The video showed 300 motorcycles parked along Keating Street, men in leather vests hauling lumber, and a house undergoing a full gut renovation without a single visible permit. Patricia was not a woman who liked surprises. She'd spent 23 years enforcing building codes in a city where half the contractors were operating off the books, and she'd seen every type of corner cutting imaginable. But this was different. This wasn't a flipper trying to save a few bucks. This was an organized invasion, as she saw it, of unlicensed, unsupervised construction performed by a known criminal organization. She didn't know that every man on that site had a valid trade license in their home state. She didn't know that the house had already passed a structural inspection by a retired city engineer who happened to be among the bikers. She saw patches. She saw tattoos. She picked up her phone and called the mayor's office. By 9 a.m., a red stop-work order was stapled to the newly framed front door. Angela stood on the porch with the paper in her hand, the same spot where she'd once cried over an eviction notice, now facing the possibility that the city would undo everything these men had built. The officer who posted it was polite but firm. "Ma'am, this structure has no permits. You're required to cease all work immediately until a full review by the city engineer. Failure to comply could result in fines up to $10,000 per day." Angela didn't argue. She didn't know how. She just looked back at the garage where David was already sitting at his new workbench, a half-assembled drone rotor in front of him, his fingers moving with the same quiet confidence he'd shown on that street. She wasn't going to let them take this from him. Sledge got the news on his phone before Angela had to say a word. He was at a Waffle House 3 miles away, fueling up for another full day of work, when Rooster sent him a photo of the stop work order. He didn't curse. He didn't rage. He just finished his coffee, paid the bill, and walked outside. Then he made one call, not to a lawyer, not to a politician, to a man named Lowell King who owned a construction company in Nashville and had been a Hell's Angel for 32 years. Lowell had a son named Marcus King, no relation to Sledge, just coincidence, who was a city councilman in Memphis, and Marcus owed Lowell everything. 48 hours later, the stop work order was lifted. Not because of threats or favors, but because the bikers had done something Patricia Delaney hadn't expected. They invited her in. Rooster met her on the porch with a 3-ring binder containing every piece of paperwork she could have asked for: engineering calculations, a structural report signed by a licensed professional engineer from the Missouri chapter, a complete permit application with fee already paid, and a letter from the homeowner granting permission. "We're not hiding anything, ma'am," Rooster said, his voice softer than his exterior suggested. "We just moved faster than your office. The delay would have cost this family their home." Patricia flipped through the binder. It was immaculate. She looked at the work itself, the perfectly level joists, the copper plumbing sweated with jeweler's precision, the new service panel installed up to code and beyond. She couldn't find a violation. She closed her binder and said, "Carry on, but I'll be back." She came back 3 times. She never found a thing. But the stop work order, brief as it was, had done something the bikers hadn't anticipated. It had attracted the press. A local news crew showed up on day 3, then a CNN affiliate. By day 5, the story had gone national. "Outlaw bikers build a future for boy who fixed a stranger's motorcycle." The headlines were everywhere. And with the spotlight came a new kind of tension. Some people were inspired, others were angry. They said the boy was being used as a prop. They said the Hells Angels were buying good publicity to cover up darker activities. They said Angela was a bad mother for letting her son near dangerous men. The comments sections turned toxic. Angela stopped looking at her phone. David, however, didn't care. He had his workshop. He had his new friends, who weren't scary bikers to him, but electricians and plumbers who called him little brother and taught him how to solder a circuit board. The drone project had exploded in scope. Wires, the software engineer, had connected David with a mentor from a Silicon Valley drone startup who'd seen the story and offered virtual lessons. A company called Aeromed, which specialized in medical delivery drones, had reached out and sent a prototype kit that retailed for $5,000, free of charge. By the end of the second week, David had built a working prototype that could carry a 2-pound payload, enough for insulin and EpiPen, a dose of naloxone, and he was already planning version 2. He'd written 9 pages of notes, his handwriting cramped but coherent, on improvements to navigation sensors. Mr. Patterson, the retired engineer from his canceled school program, had shown up at the house the day it reopened, having seen the news. He sat in the garage and watched David work, his eyes glistening. "This boy was going to be left behind," he said quietly to Wires. "The program was dead. No budget, no interest. You all saved more than a house. You saved a mind." Wires just nodded, but that night he made another call to his network. By morning, a scholarship fund had been established in David's name, seeded with $30,000 from a single anonymous donor who'd wired it through a shell charity so no one could trace it back to the club. But the real turning point, the moment that shifted this story from a feel-good miracle to a full-blown movement, came on a Tuesday afternoon. David was in the garage, doing a test flight for his drone in the backyard, when a black SUV pulled up. A woman in a navy blazer stepped out, carrying a portfolio with a university logo, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She introduced herself as Dr. Helen Cho, director of the MIT Media Lab's Youth Outreach Program. She'd flown down from Boston after seeing a video of David's drone flight that had been posted online by a neighbor. "We have a summer program for exceptional young inventors," she said, sitting across from Angela and David at the kitchen table, the new windows letting in clean afternoon light. "Full scholarship, housing, meals, mentorship. We'd like David to attend next summer, and if he thrives, we have a pipeline into our undergraduate engineering program." Angela's hand found David's under the table. She squeezed it. "What does it cost?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Cho smiled. "Nothing, we cover everything. "We've been looking for a student like David, someone who doesn't just test well but actually builds. He fits." David didn't smile. He just looked at his hands, the ones that had fixed a stranger's Harley for free, and said, "Can I bring my drone?" Dr. Cho laughed. "We'll have a lab for you." That night, after the MIT representative had left and the street was quiet, Sledge sat on the porch with Angela. The eviction notice was long gone. The house was now legally owned by her, and David had a future that stretched beyond anything she'd ever dared to imagine. But the threats hadn't vanished. A suspicious fire had been set in a dumpster behind the garage the night before, quickly extinguished by a patrolling biker. Someone had spray-painted "Go Home" on the freshly painted siding, though the bikers had painted over it before David woke up. And the gang intelligence unit of the Memphis Police Department had opened a file on the gathering, though they'd found nothing illegal and had closed it a week later with a note that read, "Community support activity. No criminal nexus." Sledge looked at Angela, the porch light catching the worn leather of his cut. "You worried about the backlash?" he asked. Angela was quiet for a moment. "I was worried about losing my son to the streets. I was worried he'd never get a chance. Now he's got MIT calling." "Let them talk. He's already won." Sledge nodded. "You're tough, Angela. You raised a good kid. But there's something else you need to know." He pulled out his phone and showed her an email from the mayor's office. The city, embarrassed by the negative press about the stop work order, had announced a new partnership with the Hells Angels for a youth trade skills program, funded in part by a grant from a local foundation. The bikers would teach welding, electrical work, and mechanics to at-risk kids in the same neighborhood. David would be the first official student. The city had flipped from adversary to partner in a matter of days, and the program would be named after David, the David Initiative. Angela read the email twice, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Why?" she asked. "Why would they do all this for one boy?" Sledge looked out at the street, where 300 motorcycles had once idled like a heartbeat. "Because your boy didn't see a biker. He saw a man who needed help. And when a 10-year-old can see past the ink and leather, it makes the rest of us wonder what we've been missing. That kind of clarity, it's worth building a future for." The street was quiet now, but the echoes of those engines would never leave. And the next morning, when David woke up, he found a letter on his workbench. It was handwritten on thick stationery, the crest of the United States Patent and Trademark Office at the top. An attorney from a pro bono firm, tipped off by Dr. Cho's office, had filed a provisional patent application for David's drone delivery mechanism, the one he'd sketched on a napkin the day before. The letter read, "Your idea is now protected. Keep building. The world is waiting." David folded the letter carefully, placed it in his toolbox, and picked up his wrench. He had work to do. And for the first time in his life, he had everything he needed to do it. A year later, David stood on a stage in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with a soldering iron in one hand and a tiny, humming drone in the other. The MIT Media Lab was not a place that impressed easily. But the auditorium, packed with professors, graduate students, and a few visiting billionaires, had gone absolutely silent as he launched the drone from his palm and guided it, via a controller he'd built himself, across the room to a volunteer actor sitting in a wheelchair. The payload, a mock insulin pen, detached gently into the man's waiting hand. The applause didn't start right away. It came in a wave, after a beat of stunned silence, the way genuine breakthroughs are greeted. Dr. Cho, seated in the front row, wiped her eyes. Behind her, a live-stream broadcast showed the scene to 7,000 backers on a crowdfunding page that had already raised enough to manufacture the first 50 units. The David Initiative, that program born from a stop work order in an embarrassed mayor's office, had grown beyond anyone's expectation. 36 kids from Memphis neighborhoods had been through the trade skills training in the first year, 13 of them girls, all of them now in apprenticeships or community college programs. The welding bay at the new Keating Community Center still smelled like fresh paint, and the sign over the door read, "This machine serves no purpose unless you do." It was the same phrase Sledge had tattooed on his forearm the month after he'd met David. He'd had it inked in the boy's handwriting, copied from a note David had left on the workbench one night. Angela hadn't known peace in 42 years, but she was learning. The house, now a warm, dry sanctuary, had a garden in the backyard that she tended in the mornings before her shift. She'd been promoted to kitchen manager at the nursing home, a role that came with a salary she could actually live on and health insurance that didn't make her stomach clench. She still had the rolled-up eviction notice, the one that had started all this, tucked in a drawer. Sometimes, when she couldn't sleep, she'd take it out, read it, and then walk to the garage where her son was inevitably still tinkering at midnight, and she'd just watch him through the window. She never told him why she was there. He never asked. He knew. The 300 men who'd shaken the windows that first morning hadn't disappeared. They'd become a quiet, persistent infrastructure. A guy named T-Bone, the saxophone player, came through Memphis every 6 weeks and took David out for barbecue, talking about music and math and the way sound waves worked. Hammer, the electrician, had taught David more about circuits in a year than most college students learned in 2. And Rooster, the grizzled coordinator, had started a nonprofit, the Seven Doors Foundation, named for the original 6 doors that had closed on Sledge that day and the one that didn't. The foundation's mission was simple: identify kids like David, ones who slip through every crack, and give them tools, not pity. By the end of year 2, they'd funded 21 scholarships and set up micro-workshops in 4 states. The final surprising detail came quietly, on a Thursday morning, when a letter arrived at the house addressed to David from the United States Patent Office. His provisional patent had been approved. But tucked inside the envelope, along with the official certificate, was a handwritten note on a cocktail napkin. It was from the attorney who'd filed the paperwork, a man named Gerald HSU. He'd been driving through Memphis on a cross-country trip and had stopped at a diner off Route 55. The server, a young woman with a baby on her hip, had recognized his MIT pin, and they'd talked. She told him about David. She told him about the boy who fixed a Harley with a crescent wrench and refused the money. And Gerald, who had a nephew on the spectrum who'd never found his place, had pulled strings at his firm to file the patent for free. But the napkin note explained that he'd also put David's name forward for a new, fully funded fellowship at MIT's engineering school, a fellowship that would cover not just David's education, but his mother's relocation and living expenses for 4 years. The fellowship had been approved that morning. David read the napkin at the breakfast table. He set it down, walked outside into the Memphis heat, and looked at the street where it had all started. The eviction notice was gone. The duct tape shoes were long since thrown away. But the boy who had knelt on the hot asphalt to fix a stranger's bike had become the very thing those 300 engines had promised: a future. And somewhere in Missouri, Sledge got a text from Angela with a photo of the letter. He read it, closed his phone, and for the first time in 20 years cried, not because he was sad, but because he'd been right. The world hadn't beaten it out of him. This kid would build a better one. The whole thing started because a 10-year-old boy with taped shoes and an eviction notice in his backpack saw a stranded stranger and refused a $20 bill. He didn't calculate the return. He didn't check for witnesses. He just knelt down and fixed it because that's what he knew how to do. 300 bikers showed up because one man saw that boy's shoes and that pink piece of paper and decided a kindness like that deserved a response that was just as irrational. They didn't bring charity. They brought lumber and tools and a fury of generosity that bulldozed every reason to say no. 6 doors would have closed. The 7th opened. And that one yes gave a mother her home, a boy his purpose, and a whole city a program that now reaches kids nobody else would reach. But here's the thing. David is not the only one. There are kids in every zip code right now, heads full of engines and drone designs and ideas that don't fit a Scantron, and they are running out of time. Their eviction notices might look different: a canceled school program, a neighborhood that's given up, an adult who looks at them and sees a problem instead of a possibility. Somebody has to be the 7th door for them. Somebody has to see past the duct tape and the quiet and the fear and say, "Come in. I see what you are." Bring them in. That's all it took. A small, honest yes in a world that had said no. If this story moved you, hit that heart and subscribe so the next one finds you. And share this with somebody who needs to remember that the smallest act of repair can build a childhood from the ground up. Because somewhere tonight, a kid with a wrench is waiting. Be the door that opens.